There was a resolution in 2019 at the Southern Baptist Convention approving critical race theory as an analytical tool. That was the first time I went, hold up, what is happening here? I have received cease and desist letters from the National Immigration Forum and the Evangelical Immigration Table trying to stop the publication of the book. I wanted to expose and ring the alarm bell to say this is going on and I want you to know who's doing it. And then for those pastors who are maybe unwittingly participating, you need to know this is what's happening, so stop participating.
Hello everyone, welcome back to the Bridgehead. Today we're going to be talking to Megan Basham. She is a culture reporter for the Daily Wire and the author of Beside Every Successful Man, A Woman's Guide to Having It All. She is a frequent contributor to Morning Wire, one of the top 10 news podcasts in the United States. She has also written for the Wall Street Journal, The Telegraph, First Things, National Review, and World Magazine, where she has also worked as a film and television editor. She has a new book out called Shepherds for Sale: How Evangelical Leaders Traded the Truth for a Leftist Agenda. It is an incredibly powerful piece of investigative reporting, exposing the ways that LGBT organizations, critical race theorists, and climate change alarmists have infiltrated the church today. We get into all of that and more in this conversation. So before we get into all the many questions I have about this book, which is a really extraordinary piece of reporting, I expected to find a lot of in-depth stuff in there because I've been reading your reporting on this for several years, but the amount you packed into this book is just incredible. And I wanted to start with a macro question, which is what I had reached out to you originally on. I was working on a column for the European Conservative on this topic of Christian nationalism, which has become a really hot topic and seems to mean different things to different people. It's kind of turned into a catch-all phrase that, according to the NBC, it means acknowledging that our rights come from our Creator. According to other people, it means pro-lifers applying their beliefs to the way they vote or the way they legislate. It does not mean, apparently, Joe Biden speaking in an African-American church. It's very selectively applied. And so because you've been covering this beat for so long, I wanted to start off with, how would you define Christian nationalism, and then how is it being used by politicians?
Well, part of what I've heard that I can sign on to is, okay, we have two different ways that we can arrange a nation. It can either be global, or it can be national. And in the sense that I believe in national sovereignty, I am a nationalist. Then we have the question of, are we going to govern it through secular principle, or should we look to transcendent biblical values? And that would be Christian nationalism. So you have some arguing for that. And I think that that is a definition that I could sign on to. You have others who are saying this is, they're talking about theocratic rule. And I think in that sense, it's become a propagandistic smear. And so when you hear it coming from the left, I think what it is a way to discourage Christians from advocating for their values in the public square by the same constitutional means that their secular neighbors do. So, it's very interesting to me to see issues like the overturning of Dobbs, which was the overturning of Roe in the Dobbs decision, which was entirely pursued along constitutional lines and using constitutional means, being characterized as Christian nationalism. So all that was Christians making use of those same levers of power. And so I think that is largely what the secular left-wing media means when they use it. So, of course, I am in favor of Christians making their voices heard in the public square and using their civic influence in every positive way for the good of their nation.
And it's kind of confusing because there seems to be a lot of confusion specifically on this, because there was a documentary that came out and you posted about it when it came out, the one by Rob Rayner on Christian nationalism. And I just watched the trailer. I couldn't bring myself to watch the documentary because it was all the usual suspects. And the reason I bring this up is because many of the people who show up just in the trailer are also mentioned in your book. And they're talking about the dangers of Christian nationalism. But presumably, most of the people that were being interviewed for that documentary would be pro-life, and presumably would support most pro-life laws, would actually support much of what a generic pro-life Republican candidate advocates for in D.C. or in state legislatures. So it isn't just the left-wing media that's going after Christian nationalism as a boogeyman. It's also a lot of the Christian thinkers, the Christian intellectuals, the Christian elites that you address in your book. What's the case that they're making?
So when they're talking about Christian nationalism, I think they're extremely unclear about the case that they're making when they say that. I mean, you have someone like, say, David French or Russell Moore and some of the other people who appeared in that movie. They sort of denigrate Christians, quote unquote, pursuing power. And yet that is what politics is. It is electing officials and pursuing policies that other people are not going to want and that, reflect your preferences that may not be somebody else's preferences. So by nature, yeah, it is pursuing power. And the assumption from them is that there is something, uniquely unchristian or negative about pursuing power. And I would say that's absolutely not the case. The question is, what are you pursuing power for? Are you pursuing power to enact the good? Because all through scripture, we would see, biblical leaders and biblical kings who were commended for doing that. Like Hezekiah, for example, we see the Old Testament say he was a good and virtuous king because he used those levers of power. In a representative republic, the people hold those levers of power. So, when I see David French, Russell Moore talking about that, what I largely see is them being very slippery about their terms. And they don't really say what they mean by that. And at the same time, yes, they still say we are pro-life, but I've seen them get very strange about what that means legislatively. For example, David French has now made the argument that the Obama administration was, in fact, the most pro-life administration that we've had because there were fewer abortions during Obama's term. Well, I think that's a very bizarre statement to make because it doesn't take into account all of the factors, which was that you had a lot of red state legislatures that were making that happen. They were putting up blockades and obstacles to abortion that lowered the abortion rate. And David French is giving credit to Barack Obama there. So that would be one of the examples of the kind of slippery thing that I see them doing when they talk about that. So I don't know that I would entirely say that they are pro-life in the same way that we used to understand pro-life, which means that we believe that it should be reflected in our law that thou shalt not kill, including the unborn.
No, that's interesting because I noted the same thing when David French, who just for our viewers who aren't aware of who he is, he's a longstanding advocate for religious freedom as a lawyer. Then he was a columnist for National Review, and then now he writes for the New York Times and almost exclusively secular and liberal publications. And I can't remember the last time he's written a column that wasn't sort of deliberately directing ire at the evangelical community. And so he's undergone this kind of pivot. And I wanted to get to that in a minute because when you say that it's state laws that made the difference, there were 342 state level laws restricting abortion that pushed the abortion rate down during the Obama presidency. And the Obama presidency saw 70% of the seats in legislatures lost to the Republicans over that 8-year period. So it is very disingenuous not to look at that and say this was a key factor in reducing the abortion rate. Before I get into sort of looking at some of the figures that you really get into the book, I've been reading your reporting, as I mentioned, on this for a long time. What was it actually that first kind of turned you on to the reality that inside evangelical circles, we were seeing all of these different Trojan horses that were being smuggled into church communities, into evangelical and Christian institutions? Because pretty much every chapter of this book just describes another Trojan horse that's being smuggled in through different means. So what was your first kind of indication that, hey, something's rotten going on here?
Right. And, before I say, I would like to preface this by pointing out that my book is not exhaustive. It's really, I just chose representative pieces all throughout evangelicalism on a variety of topics. So the idea that, I have covered the breadth of everything that's going on out there is far from the case. What I've done is hopefully arm people with, here are some examples of where it's happening so that you kind of recognize the signs and the players. And you won't be caught off your guard. Now, personally, when I first started to notice it, and I think there were some people who were much further ahead than I was, I didn't really start to pay attention to this stuff until maybe around 2019 is where alarm bells started going off for me. I think initially you felt some discomfort, like with the racial reconciliation conversation that was happening. You felt like it was starting to go in places that were beyond just saying, we have no Jew or Greek in the church, that we are all the same in Christ Jesus, to, well, what we actually need to do is generationally repent for the sins of America's past, which, we don't all have the same ancestors. And so there's this lumping together. If you're just white, then you need to repent for some things that people you were probably not related to did. There was starting to be this grievance peddling, and what I would say very much an industry of envy, saying that if you are white, you have a certain privilege and you need to take a posture of apology for that. That there seemed nothing biblical in that, or racial quotas in ministry hiring, which to me is, very unbiblical, and that we are told not to show partiality on the basis of wealth or ethnicity. So anyway, that was maybe the first thing I started noticing. And there was a resolution in 2019 at the Southern Baptist Convention, which, if you're not familiar with the Southern Baptist Convention, I spend a lot of time on it in the book because it is the largest Protestant denomination in the U.S., by far the most influential, arguably, at least until recently, the most conservative. And it represents something like 5% of Americans. So it's very much the big elephant in the room. So in 2019, they adopted a resolution approving critical race theory as an analytical tool. And I think that was the first time I went, hold up, what is happening here? And it was just as critical race theory was really beginning to be recognized and understood by the broader populace. And then at the same time, we had COVID hit. And I've come to really think of COVID as sort of a strange blessing in the church, because I think we all maybe, or not all, but a lot of us had a sense that something was starting to be a little off, but we weren't sure if it was just us or if we could name it. When COVID happened, it threw things into such stark relief that it became clear there was no longer a question that some very unbiblical ideas were being advanced in the church, and that they were being advanced on behalf of powerful actors. In this case, the federal government. So we saw churches arguing that Christians, in order to love their neighbors, had to take an experimental vaccine, something that should have very much been a personal issue of both an individual health choice and a personal liberty choice. And instead, in this very legalistic way, it was put out there by all of these ministries and ministry leaders that we needed to do this to maintain our Christian witness in the public sphere. So I think the combination of that year with the critical race theory and the reaction to George Floyd in that time, you had some of the same ministries who were arguing that we need to shut down churches. We need to make sure, for the sake of our witness, that we're all getting vaccinated. They were also out marching in BLM demonstrations. And so I think for so many of us, that made it, clear beyond question that we had something rotten in the church.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll actually skip to that part, that question that I wanted to ask you then, because I think there's a lot disturbing in this book. The most blatantly disturbing stuff, because I had already read a lot of these stories before I was aware of what was going on, but the detail that you include in your book is really chilling. And that would be the section that you have on Dr. Francis Collins, who I think I probably first heard his name back in 2009, 2010. He was sort of an example of a Christian who was in public life and obviously leveraging his influence. Whenever he was profiled, that's how he was referred to. But the reality was he not only funded, but defended these bizarre experiments on aborted fetuses. And when I say bizarre, like I saw the photographs from the University of Pittsburgh, for example, when they first released, which was little tufts of infant hair being grown on rats. This is Frankenstein stuff. And it's so horrifying that I think you actually need to see the pictures to fully understand what that's like. Because think of a baby's hair, right? It's soft, it's downy, it's precious. Like, when anybody who's ever held a baby, baby hair, like it's just like, it's where you smell them. They smell amazing, and it's sewed onto a rat. Like, this is what's going on. And that's just one of a whole list of fetal experiments. The images from the University of Pittsburgh is just like a whole page of individual little pictures of baby parts being utilized for experiments. And again, Dr. Francis Collins not only signed off on this, but he defended it later on. And at the same time, this man was seen as somebody who should be given access to evangelical audiences, and more than that, an example of a Christian witness. And as somebody who works for a pro-life organization and sees abortion as the most important moral issue, I still can't wrap my head around how those who introduced him to audiences, those who introduced him to churches, who were allegedly pro-life, sort of just waved this off, this Frankenstein stuff off as not a big deal. How do you explain that?
Right. And, part of it, I think, was that there was such, I don't know how to put it other than like gratitude that somebody at his level of power within the halls of DC was one of us, that he claimed the name evangelical, so that there was just a total inability to look at his record and say, hey, this is someone that we should not hold out as a good representative of Christian values in the public square, because he wasn't. And what was so disturbing is it became very quickly clear that they knew it. People knew Francis Collins' records. And, just to kind of piggyback on part of what you said there, it wasn't like in his role as head of the National Institutes of Health, otherwise he was known as Anthony Fauci's boss. It wasn't like the things he was doing were things that were just sort of happening in government and he was over that department, but it was happening without his desire or input. Because that was kind of what Russell Moore and some others tried to say when my initial reporting on Francis Collins came out. In fact, Francis Collins fought for continued experimentation on fetal cells and fetal parts when the Trump administration was rolling that back. So, people kind of tend to forget that at that time, around 2016, 2017, Francis Collins was giving interviews saying, well, we at NIH fought for that, but unfortunately, the administration did not hear us. So that's one thing to know. And then the other thing to know when it comes to Francis Collins as a supposed solid Christian was that under his watch, he was personally declaring himself an LGBTQ ally and launching initiatives for transgender research that included experimentation and research on children. So one of the programs that NIH funded that was in this new sort of LGBTQ department that Francis Collins launched was a program that included mastectomies on like 12-year-old girls and giving cross-sex hormones to children. And one study that included tracking the, I'm sorry to say, I'm just going to be blunt, the anal sex that teenage boys were having. And the point was that they were not to inform their parents, that they were going to track their sexual behavior, their gay sexual behavior, and their parents were not involved in this study. So these are things that should have been morally repugnant to any Christian, and yet this was what Francis Collins was involved in. So while you had him being welcomed onto these platforms at Christianity Today by people like Tim Keller, by Rick Warren, by Ed Stetzer, N.T. Wright, all very well-known leaders in the evangelical world, they were saying, here is Francis Collins, this man who is a faithful Christian. In fact, they likened him to Daniel in the court of Nebuchadnezzar. So he is one of us. And they were not giving their audience any of this other information as they were making these claims, but they were then allowing Francis Collins to come onto their platforms, encourage all Christians to obey all lockdown orders, to not resist them at all, to submit to mask mandates, including, what we now know are the entirely ineffective cloth masks, to submit to shutting down their churches, and on and on and on, to vaccine mandates. And they were using the supposed Christian witness of his as the impetus for why we should listen to him. Well, so not having that information would have been really important to know about Francis Collins. But also the question of whether this was a thing that the church should have been involved in at all, moralizing these questions about how to handle life in a pandemic. So, to me, that was just an abuse of church members, many of whom understandably revolted against this kind of narrative. And when we look back at it, I go, I don't know why a Rick Warren or a Tim Keller would do something like that, other than the fact that there was something glamorous about Francis Collins and the position that he was in as a man of extreme power in the halls of DC, like I said.
That's actually probably the kindest way that you can frame it, because I guess for me, like, I went through that chapter a couple of times because it was the way Moore introduced Collins, at that event at the university. It wasn't supposed to be recorded, where he said he saw in Collins the fruit of the Spirit, despite people's criticisms. The criticism he was referring to was all this Frankenstein stuff they were doing with baby body parts. And my view just was, if that's not disqualifying, if like funding and defending experiments on aborted babies of the sort that we know he was involved with isn't disqualifying, is not a blemish on somebody's character, then what is?
Right. And I think that's an excellent point. I mean, it was like, that was so gruesome, but it was such a part and parcel of his entire public record. His entire time in government was kind of one thing after another like that. I mean, from the very beginning, he defended, as I said, fetal cell research. So it wasn't like that was something unique or a departure from Francis Collins' character. It was the exact pattern that we had seen with him his entire time in public life. So, like I said, originally there were some pundits who tried to say, because these men were their friends, well, maybe they just didn't know. And that was why I took a lot of time in that chapter going, no, everyone knew. And in particular, Russell Moore knew. So when he was bringing him on as the head of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, which is the lobbying arm of the Southern Baptist Convention, when he was bringing Collins on and, saying, here's someone we need to listen to, and here's this Christian brother of mine, he knew these things. So, and they've never answered for why. Not just me, but lots of people since my initial reporting came out have pushed them for answers, and they have simply shut it down and ignored it.
So on that, before I get into some of the specifics of how these projects on LGBT issues, on climate change, on critical race theory are pushed in churches, I kind of wanted to take a step back and see if we can do our best to steel man the positions of some of the people we've just been talking about and that are referred in your book. So when it comes to Francis Collins, you said it's maybe the glamour of power, which again I think would be a charitable interpretation, because the extent of those experiments just defy belief. We'll actually put a link in the comments here that show people what these experiments were all about. But myself and others have tried to figure out, so where did some of these figures go wrong? So just to give you an example, I used to see Russell Moore as one of the most eloquent pro-life defenders. When he wrote columns on abortion, sometimes they were some of the most beautiful paragraphs that I've seen, articulating why Christians should abhor abortion, why it was one of the cardinal sins, child sacrifice. And David French as well he was sort of a reliably boring conservative writer for National Review. He had a phenomenal record defending free speech. He was kind of the definition of an inoffensive social conservative, right? His writing doesn't have the zip that, say, a Kevin Williamson does. But, I found myself pretty much always agreeing with him. And so with somebody like a David French, I guess what I wanted to ask was, sometimes we think that people change their minds for ideological reasons when really they're personal. And if you look at what happened to David French when he opposed Donald Trump in 2015 and 2016, many people did this, Eric Erickson, David French, especially before the Indiana primary. There was a lot of people who didn't support Donald Trump. His family was subjected to some really, really horrifying abuse by people. The kinds of things that were said about his adopted daughter, who is black, for example, online. I saw a bunch of them. I wouldn't even repeat any of the words that were used, on a podcast. The things that were said about his wife were pretty horrifying. I'm married. I've got a bunch of little kids. And if I ask myself, how would I respond if somebody attacked my wife and my kids like that? Would I adhere to principles? Would I be able to see clearly and discern exactly what was going on here? Or would I just say, those are the people who are saying horrible things? This problem is obviously endemic to entire denominations. American evangelicalism is rotten now, and basically just relaunch your career addressing issues that actually are only the fault of the people who were directly attacking you. I guess I'm just trying to discern where there is a distinct pivot in David French's career. And I'm wondering if maybe, to be charitable to him, it's because of the personal abuse he saw directed at his family, because I'd like to think that I could remain clear-headed if that was done. I'm not sure I could, though, if I'm really honest.
Well, okay, so what you said right there, that this is something that he perceived as being endemic to all of evangelicalism. I mean, obviously it's not. I mean, I don't discount, some very bad actors online. But one, I would say, look, I don't want to open up my DMs and show you what's in some of them. I mean, some of it's pretty horrifying in some frightening and personal ways. So when I say, now I know that it was at a level for him that was maybe unique to what because from what I understand, someone actually drove by his house.
Yeah.
And that would be a terrifying experience. But I think the better part of wisdom and what gives someone that maturity and discernment to be a public Christian voice is being able to make that separation between being able to say, okay, there's a nasty underbelly here that I need to speak to. But if you take that nasty underbelly and you then extrapolate and say the entire evangelical church is guilty for what this group did, then I think you have a lack of judgment and you certainly have a lack of discernment. And you have to at that point say, however sympathetic I may be for that view, I can't follow him anymore as a voice for what's happening in evangelicalism because he has shown he's too emotionally invested. And so I think that's an argument to be made that, look, maybe he is too emotionally invested and we just have to understand that about him. But then we also can't take his testimony of what's happening seriously. So, but at the same time, I think we also have to recognize that there have been some significant rewards for David French that have maybe been self-reinforcing and making some of this pivot. So, after he made this pivot, some professional opportunities came along to launch him into a stratosphere that certainly he wasn't in before he made this pivot. And I think that can be, once those rewards start to roll in, you can, whether it's self-conscious or not, go, I'm definitely doing the right thing here. And you continue feeding that audience what they want. So when you look at him making these tortured analogies about why Christians should change their position on civil marriage, I mean, that's a David French that who I used to read and like very much when he was an author at National Review. That's a David French I don't recognize, because if we say this is the moral good, man, woman, married, for throughout their lifetimes for the good of children, that is the building block of society. When you take that away and start to say, well, I know many gay, joyful families, and keep in mind, he said families, not joyful gay couples. He said gay, joyful families, and I want to ensure that, that the way they've arranged their lives is not ripped out from under them. Well, he doesn't grapple at all with the moral implications of why that's the biblical standard. Because where are the children in those gay unions that create those quote unquote families coming from? Well, now they've opened an entire Pandora's box of surrogacy trade where, women's wombs have been commoditized. And so he doesn't talk about that anymore. And I think that's when I go, that same lack of discernment that you saw there and maybe not being able to separate between some bad actors and the whole of evangelicalism has now manifested itself in not being able to understand why the biblical standard for marriage is not the good civil standard for a society. So, to me, when I look at that, I just go, I can't always judge motives, but I can show you who's trying to get a hold of those people and what the rewards were for them to change their talking points. And those stand out unequivocally. And, we can't argue with the fact that he's now at the top of the New York Times, that he's now has a plum spot as a CNN commentator and all of these things that he did not have before when he was a standard, reliable, conservative voice.
No, I agree with that completely. And if his honest perspective was, I need to address problems I see in evangelicalism, he would choose to do so from platforms that evangelicals read and engage with. Kind of dumping opprobrium from the pages of the New York Times or CNN onto evangelicals is going to have the reverse of the intended effect, if that's the effect he intends. So
yeah, it seems very much like it's throwing red meat to an anti-evangelical audience. No one anymore thinks that, for example, that David French is writing for evangelicals when he talks about how much they hurt their neighbors and hated their neighbors by not being willing to get vaccinated. I mean, that's not for evangelicals that you're doing that. You're doing that for your sort of urban Democrat leaning or hard Democrat audience who also want to blame evangelicals at that time, if you remember, for the spread of COVID, which was what was happening.
So I'll do one more attempt. So I agree with everything you said. I was just interested to see what you would say, because what's interesting for me is watching so many, what you track very well in your book is how a lot of these denominations have pivoted. And so I'm interested when I see people that I read for years, and French and Moore are both people that I read for years, and then watching their pivot, it's like, okay, what was the hinge? Like, why did they change? What were their incentives, as you've articulated? But to do one other sort of steelman approach to some of the people that you detail in your book, some of what you detail in Shepherds for Sale are debates between people who would still at least claim to hold Christian Orthodox positions. And is it possible that between some of those figures, it isn't so much about heresy as it is they commit all of their resources to where they perceive the greatest threat to be? So for some of us, I would include myself in this category, it's the creeping progressivism that has swamped the mainline denominations, and now, as you articulate quite terrifyingly in this book, is doing so to a lot of conservative churches as well. Whereas for other people, I think that they look at, say, the cover-ups and the Catholic Church of sex abuse and how it damaged the Catholic Church's credibility, especially when it came to some key social issues like the abortion referendum in 2018 in Ireland. And their view, rightly or wrongly, and I think that you articulate in your final chapters there, it's wrongly, that they believe that because this is the greatest threat, all of our resources should be dedicated in that direction. And that perhaps we don't actually disagree necessarily on Orthodox positions. What we disagree on is what the biggest threat to the church actually is, and that we're talking past each other when it comes to some of these issues. What do you think of that perspective?
I mean, it would probably depend on the specific issue if we're going to talk about it. But, you brought up the issue of abuse. I'm not Catholic, and I don't really deal with Catholicism in this book because it's specifically a book about evangelicals. But what I can tell you is that in that particular case among evangelicals, I spent a lot of time showing that numerically and as an incidence rate, an issue was created where there was not, again, from a broad brush umbrella topic, a serious problem. Which you always want to preface that by saying all abuse is terrible, and any instance of abuse should be prosecuted to the full extent of the law and should be immediately reported. And all of those things, that all of the mandatory reporting that we have in churches, people should be held accountable for that. So this is in no way discounting that. But it was to show that from an incidence rate, what we saw in evangelical churches was actually quite low, given the number of the rate of registered sex offenders in the general population. And in fact, evangelical churches are doing a pretty good job of keeping that out of their institutions. So what I was showing was that this particular issue was used as a leverage point in order to transform institutions, because good people went, oh man, I don't want there to be abuse in our churches. And if this is a massive problem, then yeah, let's restructure how we do our denominational organization in order to give some national entity authority over our churches. Let's absolutely do that. And so I would say that in many cases, what we saw was issues that were not clear cut were being treated as not just clear cut, but in Russell Moore's words, as an apocalypse issue in order to pursue political changes that when you drill down on the issue, it turned out we weren't actually talking about even child sexual abuse. We were talking about very murky cases between adults, and nobody ever drilled down on, okay, hold up. What are we talking about when we talk about these abuse cases? Who is involved? What are the rates of incidence? How do they compare to the general population? And so I spent some time doing that. And I also spent some time saying, here is why I don't think that it was motivated by a true desire to see the most important issue addressed. I think there were political motivations. I think there were personal enmities involved with Russell Moore. And that's why I spent a lot of time proving, here's my reasoning for that. Here's why I think that was the case. Now, in terms of the other issues that you talk about, do these people genuinely think that welcoming the stranger in terms of immigration and providing a path to citizenship is our most pressing issue? Or do they believe that passing a cap and trade bill to deal with climate change is our most pressing issue? They may believe that. And one of the things I do in this book is say, I think these are issues on which Christians of good faith can disagree. But they are complex issues, certainly legislatively. And they are issues that need to be argued then coming from that complex understanding of these are the trade-offs. If we enact a cap and trade policy, then what we're going to get are higher gas prices and higher grocery prices. And how does that show love to our neighbor? How does it show love to our neighbors in emerging economies, in developing nations, who will be hampered by the fact that they cannot pursue fossil fuel development to the degree that they would be able to if they weren't beholden to this Paris Accord, for example. So my issue wasn't so much that, hey, we can't disagree on this. It was the very simplistic leveraging of scripture in order to say all Christians have to sign on to this. When I go, scripture does not require you to sign on to cap and trade legislation. And that's what they were doing. So what you're doing is you're skipping a few steps. You're saying, okay, and this is something that was actually said in one of the major SBC seminaries, which was that in order to be faithful to the gospel, Christians must take up the mandate of creation care. And then creation care was defined as pursuing climate change policies. Therefore, in order to be faithful to the gospel, you must pursue climate change policies. And that's where I had an issue. So if you want to believe that that is a systemic issue that is an existential crisis, okay, we can talk about that and we can debate the science. But what I'm not going to agree to is that you can say, because we're told to be stewards of creation, all Christians must agree with this. At that point, I think, that's legalism, that's abuse of scripture, and you've skipped quite a number of steps.
Yeah, no, that was a really fascinating piece because I haven't followed that debate in really any detail because my passion lies in other directions. So like especially the pro-life parts of the book stood out to me the most, of course. You changed my mind on one piece, not so much in that I had held an established position, but that I just hadn't really thought about it. And that's the John Crist scandal, the Christian comedian who ended up having his career torched by this scandal published by RNS. And I was sort of only peripherally aware of this because I skimmed it when it came out. And I remember thinking this doesn't really seem abusive. It just seems like some scummy behavior on behalf of everybody involved. And I moved on with my life. And my tendency with some cases like that was not to be particularly bothered by the accusations flying around because I'm like, he did some dumb stuff, play stupid games, win stupid prizes, and kind of left it. But the way I really admire that at several points in this book, you take some positions that are very unpopular, but by the time I was finished reading through your reasoning, very uncontroversial, just an application of biblical principles to situations where it's currently unpopular to do so. And I really admired that. And so I wanted to actually touch on the Crist example as a segue into discussing some of these cases. As I said, I followed it peripherally, and reading through your view, it just struck me as so common sense. What was your response when the scandal broke, and how do you think the evangelical response was problematic and unbiblical?
Right. So for those who aren't aware of this case, it was right around, I think it broke, and I'd have to actually check my own book again. I feel like it was around 2019 is when I remember the story breaking. And so right around that time that, Me Too was at the height of its cultural influence. And it was like everyone had sort of signed on to this idea of what abuse was now. And it was based on power differentials and not something like someone being a victim who did not make a choice, for example, a child, to engage in some sexual activity because they were uniquely vulnerable. So it wasn't that. It was dealing with issues between adults. And so the John Crist case was, as you said, he engaged in, as he admitted, some scummy behavior. He's a well-known comedian, has a lot of funny videos on church life and evangelical life, and they go viral. And I'm sure you've seen them. So he was supposedly using his fame and influence to gain sexual favors from female fans. Immediately what happened after the story broke is Crist came out and did his mea culpa and said, I have sexually sinned. I apologize to the people that I've hurt, and I'm going to take a step back. So we've all seen that. But the reaction from the evangelical media was to rush out and assure these women, you are not at fault. This is not your fault. Now we're talking about adult women. And not only that, but in the charisma story, it was so framed that they were abuse victims that the deference given to abuse victims, that we are not going to name you, even though they were his accusers, was also followed. So these women weren't named. They were just anonymous accusers. And when I drilled down on the story, after seeing this, a flood of evangelical stories and op-eds loudly decrying the fact that we have this abuse problem in evangelicalism, I found that one, most of these women were the same age as John Crist. They will, in some cases, older than him. One was older than him and married. In all but possibly one case, his sexual attention was reciprocated. So they willingly sent him nude photos. They engaged in some form of sexting with him. And most of it, in three key cases, it all happened before he was famous. So when I initially kind of said, hold up a minute, how are we saying these women are all victims and they've done nothing wrong? They certainly have sinned. And at that point, I did a podcast episode with a member of the ERLC, a staff member of the ERLC, Trillia Newbell, who said, well, it's because fame is a sort of power. And so there was a power imbalance, and that's what made it abuse. Well, one, I rejected that outright. I don't think fame is necessarily some sort of magical power that renders women sinless if they get into sexual sin with a famous person. So I rejected that. And then the other part of it to me was that, in fact, that wasn't even true, that his relationship with these women began before he was famous. It was when they were all members of a Facebook fan group of some other author. So, what I saw was that there was just this cultural influence for evangelicals to run out and define their own Me Too moment along the cultural definitions of what abuse was. And it wasn't a biblical definition of what abuse was, because biblically, we are all responsible for our own choices. And it matters for this reason too. And I really do want to stress this, is that we can all say, play stupid games, win stupid prizes. John Crist did a dumb thing, and so that's part of the consequences if he was then defined as an abuser because he sinned sexually. Except redefining abuse in that way leaves women burdened in their consciences by their sin. If they are lying to themselves and saying, I did nothing wrong, I was a victim, when they sinned, then their consciences are not cleansed. And you have left something. You as a pastor, you as a shepherd, you as an evangelical leader have left something on that woman's heart that is separating her from God because she has not confronted that sin in her heart. So it is a bad message to give to women that as long as they can, point to some nebulous definition of power, then they're not responsible for their sexual sin. You're hurting women in that way. So that was why it was so important to me to dismantle the sort of argument that was made in that moment.
No, that was a very persuasive part of the book for me, because I was just nodding along with big chunks of the book while also being kind of stunned and horrified by how far the termites had spread and how long and well they dined. It was kind of a really, really bizarre thing to read in several sections. On the abuse section, there's one factor I want to introduce to a bunch of the recent stuff done on this. So in your book and elsewhere, because I think this is something evangelical leaders and people in general haven't grappled with. The secular left, for reasons that are obvious. I think evangelical leaders, because they don't recognize the extent of the problem. So one of the things that I write for First Things for the European Conservative, one of the beats that I regularly cover is the porn industry and the impact of pornography, not only on the culture, but inside the church. And I also speak in high schools and Christian churches and a lot of Christian schools. I did 3,500 students in the last little while. And one of the things I think that has not been grappled with, that is going to muddy the waters further and make it more difficult to ascertain what is not abuse and what is abuse, is the fact that we have a generation of kids that are, to the most part, unless they have incredibly vigilant parents, growing up and encountering digital sexual violence, and that this is normative. Having spoken in Christian schools, like like, again, over 3,000 students just in the last 8 months. One class I spoke in recently, every girl in grade 11 has struggled with porn in the last 6 months. I'm meeting kids who first encounter porn between the ages of 5 and 9 years old, and that's not unusual. And these are conservative Christian schools, the only kinds of schools who are going to invite an anti-porn talk in to begin with. And what has struck me is that the questions I get from girls who are 12, 13, 14, 15 is, my boyfriend's asking me to do this. Like, can I? What is that? And these are all very abusive behaviors. Involves incredibly unnatural behaviors, behaviors that are violent by definition. And this is kind of something that most of the church leadership isn't fully aware of. They're not fully aware of what the young people are consuming, what they're finding on their phones, what's on the front page of Pornhub. They're not aware of the fact that pornography this is not your grandfather's porn. This isn't Playboy or Hustler. This is very different stuff. And that this is actually shaping the way kids view sexuality. So I've had questions from girls who are 14, 15 and say, this happened to me. Like, was the sexual assault? And it was by definition, and that it was violent, but it was also consensual in some strange way, but they're being groomed to believe that this is normative. It's incredibly difficult to parse these things. And you noted some data on campus sexual assault. I think the most shocking stats are stats that nobody has grappled with yet because of the obvious implications of them. So the Atlantic reported that 24% of American women on college campuses admitted to being spontaneously choked during intimacy in the past 6 months, inspired by pornography. They didn't claim to be assaulted, but what they said was, we're kind of opting out of dating now. We don't like this dating scene. It's toxic. It's informed by Pornhub. And so this is not covered in your book, but I wanted to inject this new evangelical reality into the discussion, because I think it's only going to get more and more difficult to determine this. Our sexual economy is shattered at the moment because of the fact that kids have a pipeline directly to things like Pornhub. None of the data from Barna Group and other evangelical sources have any good news on the rates of addiction, even among church leaders. How would you factor that information into your own reporting? You're a mother, so I assume that you deal with this on a personal level. How do we start to grapple with this open-ended question?
Right. And I think that goes to the fact that I feel that the Me Too rage that sort of bubbled up at that moment was actually coming from a legitimate place, even if the application of those ideas to me was culturally illegitimate. So what it did was to sort of demonize all men who were playing by the rules that we set in a certain sense, right? The idea was that, well, as long as everything is consensual, then whatever we do is completely fine and there's no moral implications of what we're doing. Everybody agreed to this. What women in that moment, I think, were on some level understanding was that, no, I am being used and I am being damaged and hurt in some way. And there was a rage over that. But because we had set up this sexual economy that said, all consensual sex is positive and good and moral, there was nowhere for that rage to go. And so it kind of came out in these twisted ways that redefined what was happening. And so you could see some men, for example, I don't remember the comedian, but there was a comedian who, when you read the story, he sounded like an incredibly callous man who was demanding oral sex from women and on a date, and she agreed, and she came away saying, I was abused. Well, she did do it willingly, but she did recognize that I was mistreated here, and she was mistreated.
Aziz Ansari.
Well, that's who it was. It was Aziz Ansari. And the fact that she was mistreated, that's true. And that we live in an extremely twisted culture that has now, we've had Cosmopolitan for how many decades now telling her, no, actually, that was you at your most liberated and empowered. Well, I think that lie has now played out so long, and we see exactly how toxic it's become, so that women are understandably recognizing, I don't feel empowered, I don't feel liberated. So it was this bizarre moment of, at the same time that we still have this Playboy cosmopolitan culture, you also had women going, well, what I want is for you to acknowledge that you abused me because you have some power that I don't have. And those two things cannot be reconciled. I mean, what we have to realize then is that there is a moral component to even the most consensual sex, in that someone is being hurt. In fact, both parties are being hurt if it is not done within the biblical confines of two people who are committed to one another in marriage. So we were all recognizing this, but certainly we can't return to the biblical standard. Therefore, I don't know, it had to be patriarchy's fault. It had to take on these sort of Marxist contours of oppressor and oppressed. And that's what we saw. So it became, well, because men hold more power, therefore men are abusers. And then you had kind of something that, you know, even the most legalistic Puritan would never have come up with, which was these lists of, may I touch your hand? Yes, you may, posted on college campuses, which was a really sort of bizarre twist in all of this. And so, yeah, I agree with you that as the church, we haven't dealt with that. And instead, what we did was absorb the bizarre oppressor oppressed categories instead of saying, hey, women, yeah, actually, it's right that you feel this way, even though you sinned and you need to deal with that. And it was a moment to preach the gospel that we missed. It was a moment to say, you feel bad about this because that was sin. And you live in a sinful, sorry for my dog. You live in a sinful, fallen world. And part of living in a sinful, fallen world is you're being exploited sexually. So the way out of this is to run to the cross, confess your own sins, and then conduct your life in such a manner that you do not become the used up plaything of men anymore. The only man you should be having that relationship with is a man who loves you enough to commit to you in marriage.
So I agree with all of that. And I think one of the reasons that we're seeing a lot of rage is because even a lot of young Christian men are carrying porn-inspired practices into marriage because it's the only sex education that they've received. They haven't received a positive vision of biblical sexuality. They haven't been introduced to what that looks like in a healthy way. And it's interesting. I first noticed the shift, culturally speaking, when we had this sort of minor celebrity radio host who was accused of abuse by 13 women, and everything he had done was explicitly sexually violent because he had choked, he had done all these kinds of things. And the newspaper accused him of unwanted sexual violence. And that encapsulated this shift that we've seen where sexual violence can be occurring, but we no longer know how to categorize it because we've mainstreamed sexual violence, which is why when...
Kinks.
Yeah. When Ross Douthat said, we're seeing sexual violence go down by all the data. I'm like, no, we've actually reclassified a lot of what would have explicitly applied as something else because of our new sexual standard. But then... How do we open the conversation on pornography in the church in this way, in connection to this issue? Because there are circumstances that happen. I've had probably hundreds of these conversations with students at Christian schools where there's no power imbalance in terms of like teacher-student or anything like that, but the power balance is just sort of inherently physical. Because the male is usually stronger, the girl is usually weaker, and he wants to try out stuff that he's seen in porn. And pornography taught him that when somebody says no and pushes back, you push forward. So he's literally programmed to think, well, this is all part of it. But that's not actually the case. It blurs everything. It's kind of a horror show. Like I saw a meme that kind of encapsulated this. It says what other millennial looks at dating now and thinks I caught the last chopper out of Nam, which is how I feel because,
right.
The first smartphone came out the year after I graduated high school. So I missed having, a Pornhub pipeline directly to my frontal cortex. Most young Christians these days aren't so lucky. And I just feel like we need to have an open conversation in the church on what this looks like. And that conversation hasn't even really begun in earnest yet, I don't think.
Yeah, and I think that would have been the better conversation to have. And it's obviously, as I said, what you see in so many of these topics is that these incredibly complex issues that you're bringing up, those things are flattened out into just sort of accepting, the very easy cultural narrative. And I think that's what we did. When you get to that, as far as a solution, I hope it doesn't sound simplistic now that I've just accused people of not being complex enough, but I really don't think that issue is that hard, except to say, these are the kinds of sexual deformations that you get when you depart from this gospel standard, when you depart from this biblical standard. And it points to the fact that God did not put these things in place to deprive you of pleasure or to deprive you of relationship. In fact, these guardrails were put in place by a God who knows us and loves us and wants to protect us. And that is why it is good for women and men to adhere to them. It's why you don't allow porn into your brain. It's why you control your mind, you discipline your impulses from lusting over that which does not belong to you, because all of these things, whether to your own soul or to someone else's soul, are harmful. And it feels like we are missing a moment there to step into this cultural chaos with a biblical message that is so profound and yet also so simple, and yet also so incredibly countercultural, that maybe we're in a moment where people might listen to us. And to give you just, one quick pop culture example, look at Russell Brand, for example. I mean, it feels a little bit like that process that you're describing, where pornography that he admittedly was addicted to told me that as long as everything's consensual, that these things are okay. And yet we can also look at that and go, that was predatory behavior. That wasn't good. And yet we also now see a sort of famous person who's coming to recognize that these biblical guardrails would have been good for me because I damaged my soul in doing these things. And I am now being renewed and restored from that. So I kind of feel like, look, church, if we don't jump on this moment right now, a better one may never come.
No, I completely agree. And it's frustrated me. One of the reasons I get so frustrated about this particular issue is because I feel like secular commentators are doing what evangelical leaders and Christian leaders should be doing. You got Bill Maher coming out and saying, this is really disgusting, guys. This is like one of Hugh Hefner's best friends. You got Billie Eilish.
Right.
Billie Eilish coming out and saying, pornography was so vile and it deformed my brain so much that I allowed boys to do horrifying things to me for years, like really violent things. And she said that like pornography wrecked my brain is what she said, right? It's like, why is she saying that? Why aren't we saying that more clearly, more articulately? There's a lot of silence around that issue. And so reading that chapter in that book, and I'm like, there is a whole discussion we should be having right now that applies to every church, that applies to almost every family, that we need to be tackling. And instead, we're doing whatever nonsense you were describing in that chapter in this book.
Yeah, absolutely. And, when I look at what's happening, I do feel very frustrated that we don't have a clearer voice in that, and that we are sort of devolving into this morality of consent. And all I can think is that nobody wants to look like Ned Flanders, right? Well, we need to get to a place where we're unafraid to look like Ned Flanders. However churchy you think it is, or however naive and simple-minded, it is the word that the world needs to hear right now. So we don't need to be more sophisticated than Scripture. Let's just lay it out.
So to get to the money for a minute, when you're looking at all these different institutions, like the detail that you have in here about the way major organizations like the Arcus Foundation, for example, are funding these different and trusted Christian institutions. So you did the typical journalist thing, which is you just followed the money. And what you found was pretty shocking. It explained a bunch of things for me. It explained the drift of Christianity Today, for example, the Evangelical flagship magazine founded by Billy Graham. I've written for it before, but couldn't understand why. Like, I wrote for it like quite a number of years ago on the abortion issue, but I noticed what you've tweeted about often, which is like, why are they not touching the issue of transgenderism, where, half of the American states have passed laws banning these procedures in some form, 25 out of 50, and yet crickets. So how is this money flowing in, and how is it changing these institutions that we used to like? I think that you say at one point they're kind of hauling these institutions out and wearing them like a skin suit, which was a pretty macabre but very effective analogy.
Yeah, I can't claim credit for that. I think Orrin McIntyre was the first person I saw coin that phrase, but it is a great phrase, and it's funny because it's sort of a punchy new way to update that old conquest law that any institution which is not self-consciously conservative eventually becomes liberal. And I think you can say that about theological conservatism as well. And so really what I did was just look at, one, these organizations that bear the name of evangelical, like your Evangelical Immigration Table, your Evangelical Environmental Network, they are the ones who are sort of pushing for specific policy prescriptions and baptizing them with Christianese and saying all Christians need to sign on to them. And if you take, just to give you one example, because it's so popular right now with voters, actually, I should say it's so unpopular right now with voters, which is the immigration issue. You went, where did this come from? And as you track the Evangelical Immigration Table, what you find out is it's really a front group of a secular left organization called the National Immigration Forum. So, it was founded around 2012, 2013. specifically at that time to promote the Chuck Schumer, John McCain Gang of Eight bill, which provided a pathway to amnesty, I would say. Essentially, you could buy citizenship for around $1,000. Or legal status, not citizenship, but you could buy legal status and then after another 10 years earn your citizenship, which is a much easier way to do things if you're already here than having to wait in line when it can take as long or longer and be just as expensive. So why would you not jump the line? So that's when it was founded. And then you look at, okay, well, who's funding the National Immigration Forum, who is then funneling money to the Evangelical Immigration Table? And let's keep in mind, there is no legal separation between these two entities. And you look at the fact that in the first few years of its existence, the major backer of the National Immigration Forum was George Soros's Open Society Foundation. And as you go on, you find in 2016, there was a leak of documents from George Soros's foundation that showed that they specifically targeted not just evangelicals, but the Southern Baptist Convention as the largest Protestant denomination in order to win evangelicals over to that type of Gang of Eight bill. And so, they ran a program called Bibles, Badges, and Business, and they openly admit through National Immigration Forum, we funneled money into that program in order to win evangelical voters. And so that is kind of the process by which it's happening. And so when you look at Evangelical Immigration Table, again, a front group of the National Immigration Forum, and you look at the groups that have signed on to this, it is all of the institutions who have been, long respected and established in evangelicalism, like the National Association of Evangelicals, which represents some 45,000 churches in dozens of different denominations, which was once so conservative, Ronald Reagan gave his famous Evil Empire speech to its national convention. So that tells you exactly who we're talking about. Also, the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities. It represents 185 Christian schools, including very conservative schools like Biola. So what you're seeing is these institutions that are very trusted are being brought into these evangelical front groups that are being funded by left-wing foundations. And again, that's just one example. So that traces how it happens. And its explicit goal, when you look at an organization like the Evangelical Immigration Table, isn't to do something like spread the gospel to immigrants, regardless of how they came to be here, which is something that we could all agree with. That's not what its purpose is. Its purpose isn't seeing to the material needs of immigrants, regardless of how they came to be here. Its purpose is to get legislation passed. And that is unequivocal in its own documents. It talks about, it hires mobilizers to do things like connect pastors to legislators so that the pastors will convince the conservative legislators, hey, evangelicals really want you to pass, for example, Senator Langfort's bill that would have let in 5,000 illegal immigrants per day. So that really is what I'm talking about, is that this is a very political infiltration, and it's something that, they don't exactly put there on their front page, and you have to do a lot of digging to get to that information. And I think you have a lot of well-meaning pastors who they see their friends involved in these organizations. They don't look deeply in it themselves. They get an email from a buddy who says, hey, your church should use this curriculum from the Evangelical Immigration Table. And so they bring it in, or they sign on to the letter that gets published in the New York Times, and they're not giving thought to who's behind it. And so that was really what I wanted to expose and, ring the alarm bell to, is to say this is going on. And one, I want you to know who's doing it. And then for those pastors who are maybe unwittingly participating, you need to know this is what's happening. So stop participating.
Yeah. So one of the things that I found encouraging about the book was that the percentage of evangelicals who actually hold to orthodoxy on life and marriage issues is actually really high, higher than I thought it would be. I was not particularly surprised to discover that, I think you said 67% of Catholics were LGBT affirming, but a very, very high number of evangelicals were still clinging to orthodoxy, which has made them the target of all these major organizations who essentially see institutions like the SBC as the last bulwark to completely getting their agenda implemented at every level across the country. Was there anything you found when you were doing this research that surprised you? Like, there was individual examples that really shocked me. I knew that this campaign was happening because you can see it unfolding everywhere. It seems like a new church caves every month sometimes. But was there anything that surprised you when you started really diving down into the details here?
Yeah, well, since you bring up the LGBTQ issue, and by the way, what I just mapped out is absolutely happening on that issue as well with a group called the Arcus Foundation, which is the largest LGBTQ grant maker in the country. So what surprised me was the inroads that they have managed to make with some very well recognized churches that, as cynical as I am, I still went, wow, you're kidding me, when I found it, which, for example, Saddleback. So, I mean, it's hard to find a more influential pastor than Rick Warren and his church Saddleback. And yet some of this LGBTQ, you know the letters. Anyway, LGBTQ affirming curriculum had made its way into his church. There were 4, and could, for all I know, still could be 4 ongoing groups using this LGBTQ affirming curriculum, embracing the journey. And when I asked about it, it shocked me that Saddleback did not respond. They simply removed all references to that material from the website. And the counseling pastor on their staff who had been behind promoting this curriculum and who was participating in Arcus-funded conferences, he disappeared off the staff website, but I later found out, no, he still works there. His LinkedIn disappeared. So it shocked me that they just so nakedly just made everything disappear and didn't answer any questions and just tried to pretend like that never happened, though it may still be going on, since I do know that this particular pastor still works there. So that really shocked me. And maybe I would say some of these Arcus funded groups who have made it their aim to infiltrate conservative churches and change their theology from the inside, how open they are in some sense about what they're doing. For example, one of those is the Reformation Project, which is an Arcus funded group that has done a number of conferences with people from Andy Stanley's church, North Point, Rick Warren's church, Saddleback, and some other large churches, that they have a program called Pastors and Process, which they openly say, if you go on their website, hey, are you a pastor, an affirming pastor who is trying to bring your non-affirming congregation along to your position? Enroll in our confidential program, and we will teach you how to slowly and quietly bring them in that direction. I'm paraphrasing, of course, but that is what the material says, is that it is a confidential program. So how many pastors are in that? How many pastors have been through that program? We have no idea, but it's important to know that it's well-funded and it's happening.
Do you have any general idea of sort of the percentage of, say, conservative SBC churches that have been affected by this?
You know, that's really hard to say. I don't know, because no, particular study has been done on that. And in fact, the SBC has gone to some pains to not confront this issue. They make their resolutions, and its official position is obviously to, affirm a biblical understanding of sex, gender, and marriage. But when it came out that there were churches that were baptizing unrepentant, practicing homosexuals, the Credentials Committee of the SBC has not dealt with it. They have very much slow rolled that issue. There have been openly affirming pastors, and those were not dealt with. So there's a credentials process by which, if you're not familiar with the SBC, it's not a typical denomination with a top-down authority structure. It's really just a loose association where you get to be a member of the club and contribute money to things like missions and seminaries and things like that. But there is a removal process, and the removal process has not been followed in those cases. So I do know that. I know that even in the SBC, there has been a reticence to confront it when it's coming in. And then if you look at the PCA as well, you're seeing this entrance of things like revoice, which is redefining what biblical sexuality is in order to include things like gay identification, like I am a gay Christian. And one, I would say we should never identify with our sin. We never say, I am in a positive way, I'm a lustful Christian. I'm a lust Christian. I don't know how you would even word it, but this identification with sin is something that's unique to that. And so new allowances were being made for this fashionable sin that were not made for any other sin. And so this was being brought in through these revoice conferences. And part of what they did was teach that you can be a part of a celibate gay partnership. So, you're not having sex, but you have made some sort of spiritual, romantic commitment to one another. And when you have a denomination as conservative as the PCA and the SBC, it came into the SBC to some degree as well, and it went undealt with when you had SBC professors signing on to speak at Revoice events and endorsing Revoice. That was a problem. And everybody was so slow that it had to get to the point where Revoice was having conferences where, people were wearing their pronoun buttons and they were queer identifying and they were talking about what queer treasure we might find in heaven. So it had to get to that point before there was finally someone to step forward and go, all right, we have got to deal with this.
Yeah, like I know my background is Reformed. I attend a Reformed church. And when the PCA showed up, I'm like, you had PCA guys at a Revoice conference? Like, that was pretty wild.
Right.
So
yeah.
Yeah, no, so some of the names that showed up too were very disturbing. I guess one of the things I wanted to know on a personal level is, what has the response been to the book so far? And what kind of impact are you hoping to make with the book? Because it reads like a bombshell, and there's a lot of stuff in here, I think, that should genuinely make a difference, that should shock a lot of leaders. Presumably you're hoping it has that impact. So what response have you gotten so far, and what impact are you hoping this investigation has?
Well, there's been a lot of positive response. I have gotten support from people that I might not have expected, given that it was characterized as unkind to expose some of these things by, I would say, institutional leadership. And so the encouragement I got from people like Rosaria Butterfield, if you're familiar with her, who, has had some wonderful books out and has an incredible testimony of leaving a life of lesbianism. And that she encouraged me so much. Like that meant the world to me. The pastor who I kind of look to as my spiritual father, other than my own father, John MacArthur, stepping forward and also endorsing the book, encouraging people to read it, people like Vodi Bakum. That's been some heady stuff for someone who, became a Christian and was sanctified through so much of their work. To suddenly have them not only know my name, but recommending my work was, I can just say that was just a gift from God to me, and I'm so grateful for it. On the other side of the coin, I will say I have received, cease and desist letters from the National Immigration Forum and the Evangelical Immigration Table trying to stop the publication of the book. I've received, there have been back channel letters to my publisher saying, we, this large evangelical organization, are very concerned about how we might be depicted. And given that we have so many associations in common with your other imprint, Harper Christian, we just thought maybe we could have a meeting with you and talk to you about these concerns we have with Megan Basham's work. So, I was very aware that there were back channel efforts, as well as, straight to my face, legal efforts to try to shut it down. And at each turn, God has been incredibly gracious in providing both courage from my publisher, but also legal backing that I wouldn't have had the money to have myself. A friend stepped forward and said, hey, we're going to hook you up with a free speech legal team, and you don't need to worry about this. Just do your work. So I just feel incredibly well provided for. And I think as far as readers, I think it's obvious to so many people what's been going on. They maybe didn't have a name for it, and they didn't have specifics. And so I can tell you that pre-orders have been going through the roof. And I think that's because a lot of people went, okay, we knew something was up and we want answers. And so I think there's just a real hunger out there to understand what was going on, who were the players, and what was happening behind the scenes that explains what we've all suspected for so long.
You think Christianity Today will review it?
I think they might, though it'll be interesting to see what they focus on. So, yeah, I don't know. I've heard they've been trying to get a look at the manuscript. Let's put it that way.
Well, thank you so much for taking so much time to talk about it, and congratulations on the book. It's just an excellent piece of work.
Well, thank you so much, Jonathan. I appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us for this conversation. If you want to hear other conversations like it, you can subscribe to this YouTube channel. You can also find our content wherever you get your podcasts, or you can head over to thebridgehead.ca where we post both written commentary and video. Thanks so much for joining us.